Professor Hasselman, History 105, and this week we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. Last week we talked about the Enlightenment, the development of despotism, and then we talked about the Enlightenment in practice and the American Revolution. And now we're going to turn back to Europe, back to our Western civilization core, and talk about France and its time during its revolutionary period. So one can argue that our course has been outlining the principal cause of the French and attendant revolutions from the very beginning. Now, it could be argued that the whole political, social, and economic system of Europe was unfair, inefficient, oppressive, and unrealistic, and bound to come apart sooner or later. But if we can agree that this was the case, and many historians would not, that still does not explain why the changes began in France in 1789. Now, French government finances had passed in and out of trouble throughout the 18th century. These financial problems were due to recurrent war. The French failed to manage and service government debt as productively as the British did. For most of the 18th century, the two wealthiest groups in the country, the aristocrats and the clergy, paid proportionately less in taxes than the peasantry. Now, to these long-term problems was added the debt from two most recent American wars. Louis XV had imposed a special war tax on everyone, as well as a tax on office holders, and he kept those taxes on the books despite the protest of the aristocracy and the clergy. Now, this led to a storm of protest from nobles, office holders, and local parlement, who argued, using the language of the philosophes, that this infringed on their ancient rights. Now, when as early as 1787, when Louis XIV called an assembly of the notables to address the financial crisis still lingering from the American War, representatives of the nobility questioned whether there really was a crisis, charged that the court just wanted more money, and demanded to examine the books. By 1787, half of all government revenue went to pay interest on the debt. Now, by early 1789, the French crown was in financial crisis. Now, the peasants and middling orders were expected to solve the crisis by paying the French tax bill. The general condition of the French peasantry had been improving throughout the 18th century. The peasantry had gone long periods without famine. In 1789, peasants owned about 40% of the land in France, a much higher proportion than most of Europe. But the high tax burden meant that many peasants still lived on the margins of poverty, and a bad harvest could cause some peasants to fall into poverty. Now, the years 1787 to 1789 saw a series of bad harvests. This led to starvation of the poorest peasants and loss of purchasing power by the rest and by urban workers known as the sans-culottes, or without knee breeches, because as working men they wore trousers. Landlords reacted by raising grain prices and rents to maintain their profit margins. Peasants were unable to pay the taille, or the head tax. And the additional defenders of the peasants were the 13 regional parlements, led by the Parlement of Paris, but in May of 1789, Louis XVI, reacting to their protests about religion and high taxes, abolished them. Now, the financial crisis reached the boiling point in August of 1788. Law and order broke down. People began to demand a meeting of the Estates General. Now, this ancient institution had not been called since 1614. Now, recall the failure of the Fronde revolt at the end of the 30 Years' War. The Estates General was a tricameral body representing the traditional estates of France. The first estate was the clergy, owning about 10% of the land. The second estate was the aristocracy, owning 25% of the land. And the third estate was the commonalty, or everybody else, about 95% of the population. Any legislation in the Estates General had to win the approval of two of the houses or estates. Now, the third estate was elected by all adult males, not included in the other two. Now, given that poor farmers had little standing, those who were elected were more likely to be lawyers, bankers, and merchants of the middling orders. The middling orders had been reading the philosophes, and many took up the plight of the peasants. Local grievances were conveyed to the estates through cahiers de doléances, arguing for the end of absolutism and permanent legislature. Now, no matter what the representatives of the Third Estate approved, the structure of the Estates General dictated that they had to win over one other estate or the reform would be stillborn. Now, a flood of pamphlets appeared demanding vote by the head, not by the estate. Now, the Estates General convened in May of 1789. After the king refused to rule on how the estates should vote, the Third Estate invited members of the other two to join them to form a national assembly in June. Now, some nobles and clergy, having read the philosophes, did so. This ad hoc body proclaimed itself the National Assembly on the 17th of June. Government officials reacted by locking them out of the Parisian meeting place, and on the 20th of June 1789, the National Assembly went in an indoor tennis court across the street from their usual meeting place and took the tennis court oath to remain until France had a new constitution. Now, at this point, the king hesitated to react, which only served to create a climate of fear in France. By late June, the sans-culottes of Paris, encouraged by the formation of the National Assembly, but they were encouraged, but they worried that Louis could crush it, and they began to organize. On the 14th of July, 1789, they stormed the Bastille, looking for arms. Now, they soon took over the government of Paris, and throughout France in the summer of 1789, chateaux were burned and aristocrats fled. Now, as France burned, the National Assembly, later known as the Constituent Assembly, worked on the new constitution. On the 4th of August, 1789, aristocrats in the National Assembly renounced their privileges. For example, Vicomte de Noailles became Citizen Noailles. A month later, on 26th of August, 1789, the National Assembly ratified a statement of principles, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a summary of Enlightenment thought on the state, which you'll be reading during this week. But it said nothing about the rights of women, which led women to political demonstrations and Olympe de Gouges to react with their own Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791. Nothing in the Declaration addressed the gross inequalities of wealth and property in Ancien Regime France. More ominously, it did not address the proper balance of rights between the individual and the state. Again, Louis could have embraced the document, but his queen, Marie Antoinette, urged Louis to suppress the revolution. As before, Louis hesitated before finally approving the Declaration of Independence, months later. On the 5th of October, 1789, a Parisian crowd, reacting to rumors that the king would act against the revolution, stormed Versailles and forced the royal family into house arrest at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Now, the Constitution of 1789 took 2 years to draft. France remained a monarchy, but one governed by a constitution. The king was no longer divine or absolute, but the first officer of the state. He retained control of the military and foreign policy, and he had a suspensive vote 2 years on legislation. The legislature was unicameral, so one house, and elected every 2 years. It initiated legislation, it controlled the budget, and it had the exclusive right to declare war. Now, the electorate consisted of male citizens with property, about 4 million out of 25, the widest franchise in Europe. There was a stricter property qualification for a seat in the legislature. The local government of France was to see the old provinces abolished and replaced with 83 equal, rational départements, whose 40,000 officials were to be elected by all adult males. The church was to be federalized or nationalized. Its lands were to be confiscated to pay off government debt and redistributed to the peasantry. The clergy were to become paid officials of the state, and priests and bishops were to be elected by property-owning citizens, and need not be Catholic. The society and economy were to experience the abolition of privilege. All people were to be equal under the law, including blacks and mulattoes. Guilds and monopolies were to be abolished. Now, this was a truly revolutionary attempt to expand civil liberties, empower the middling orders, and base the state on reason and not faith. Now, it depended on the cooperation of the ruler, the ruling class, and the people of France and the rest of Europe. Now, in fact, almost none of these groups were satisfied. Peasants were upset because they wanted to vote for the legislature and they wanted to end the economic disparities. The church was upset by the loss of land and their status as the sole regal religion in France. The aristocracy was upset at the loss of privilege. Louis XVI faced a crossroads. He could have embraced the new constitution and become the first citizen of France. Instead, in June of 1791, he fled Paris in secret for Austria, homeland of Marie Antoinette, where he hoped to raise troops to crush the revolution. He was seized by revolutionary guards at Varennes, near the Austrian border. Louis was completely discredited and became a prisoner. In August of 1791, the governments of Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, urging all European monarchs to band together to restore Louis. By April of 1792, Austria and Prussia invaded France. They were eventually joined by Great Britain, Spain, and Russia. Now, the events of 1791 to 92 convinced the French people that they were no longer the subjects of a king, but the citizens of a nation. In reaction to the situation, a revolutionary officer named Rouget de L'Isle penned what became the French national anthem, La Marseillaise. The song inspired the French people to rally to the revolution, form a citizen army, and defeat the invading Prussians and Austrians in September 1792 at Valmy. This was the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, which, along with the ensuing Napoleonic Wars, would last on and off to 1815. Now, because the French Revolution threatened every crowned head, every aristocrat, and every bishop in Europe, and European ruling elite rose up to try to crush the French Revolution, just as foreign powers had earlier stepped in to quash early rebellions in the Netherlands and Poland.